essential materials needed for any quilting project is going to be a cutting mat, a measuring board, this particular one is known as an Omni Grid, and also a cutting tool. You are also going to need your fabric. This particular quilt has 3 different fabrics. Your batting, which is going to be the inside of the quilt, and then also your sewing machine and thread. When choosing your fabrics, you want to make sure that they're of the same type. If not, you may want to pre-wash your fabrics so that you do not have shrinking issues later on with your quilt. In this video, we're going to be demonstrating how to make your basic square pattern.
The first step to making your quilt is to cut all of your fabric. The size fabric we're using right now is just going to be 5-inch squares. So you need to line your fabric up on the cutting mat, and this cutting board I have is made to cut 5-inch pieces of fabric. Once you have a strip cut out, you can turn it lengthwise, and now you can cut your 5-inch piece.
You want to have all your fabric cut out before you start sewing. This will save you time and aggravation later on. When we're ready to sew, we're going to put our 2 pieces front to front, and then we're going to line up the edges. We are then ready to start our sewing process. This is your finished section. You need to continue sewing until you've reached your desired quilt length. You have your strips sewn together to their desired length. You're going to put them face to face, and then you're going to sew them together to start your width of the quilt. Once you have finished your front panel, it is time to get started on your back panel. You may pick one of the fabrics from the front side of the quilt, or you may pick a solid color. We have chosen the striped pattern from the front. Once we are ready to assemble our quilt, you're going to have the bottom layer. As you can see, it's back. The back is what we're seeing. Then you'll have your batting, and then you will have your actual quilt that you've made from all your pieces. Once you're ready to quilt your pieces together, if you do not have a heavy-duty sewing machine, you may want to consult your quilting center or fabric store to see where they may have a long arm machine that you can take your quilt to for final assembly.
When it comes time to put your quilt together, you need to safety pin the 3 pieces so that they don't move during the quilting process. You first need to pin along the 4 edges, and then you need to sporadically place pins throughout the middle of your quilt as you see here. There's many different options on how you can sew your quilt together. I chose to do a diagonal line through my squares. You can also go down the seam where you sewed your squares together if you don't want your lines to be seen. Once you have your quilt sewn together, you need to come up with binding to put around the edges. You need a 2.5 inch strip of fabric that is long enough to go around the edge of your quilt. You can do one edge at a time, or you can have a piece long enough to go around the entire perimeter of your quilt. You need to choose a fabric that is a contrasting color to the back. It can still be one of the ones from your front piece. I chose the polka dotted fabric. Once I cut my 2.5 strip, I folded it in half, ironed it so that it had a crease. Once you have your binding piece folded in half and ironed, you need to put your open edge and line it up against the edge of your quilt. Then you're going to sew down the edge of your quilt and the edge of the open side of your binding. Before you begin sewing your binding onto your quilt, you need to use straight pins and attach it so it's not moving while you're sewing. Once you finish sewing your binding onto your quilt and you've cut off your extra batting and back fabric, you can take out the pins that you put in earlier and turn your binding over to the other side of the quilt. Once you turn it over, you need to pin down your binding, that way you can continue sewing it onto your quilt. At this point, it's up to personal preference. You can hand sew your binding on this side underneath, that way you don't see your threads. Or you can go back to the machine and zigzag thread it down the edge where you're going to visibly see your threads. It's completely up to you.